The cold autumn night in Brooklyn was like every other for Emily, a waitress trapped in a world of routine, exhaustion, and isolation. But tonight something felt different. Something was shifting, a storm quietly brewing in her life. When she crossed paths with three young sisters, her simple, solitary world would never be the same. She didn't know it yet, but the past was about to collide with the present, and Emily would have to face the weight of her own history in order to save theirs. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. This is just the beginning, and you won't want to miss what's next. The small, dimly lit restaurant on the corner of 7th Avenue buzzed with the usual rhythm of clinking silverware, murmur of voices, and the sizzle of food on the grill. Emily moved between the tables with practiced ease, her smile polite but distant. At 28, she had become a fixture at this low-end diner, a place that paid her just enough to survive, but not enough to ever feel truly alive. Her boss, Gerald, was as cold and pragmatic as they come. He was a man of few words, a man who believed that feelings had no place in business. For him, Emily was just another cog in the machine, her worth measured by how quickly she could turn a table, how many customers she could serve with a smile, and how little noise she made. It wasn't that Emily didn't try to make connections. She did, in the quiet corners of her own mind. She just didn't have the luxury of time or emotional energy to let those connections run deep, not when the work was endless and the paychecks barely covered the rent. She was a survivor, plain and simple. But tonight, as she wiped down a table by the window, her attention was drawn to a trio of young girls standing outside the restaurant. They were huddled together on the sidewalk, shivering from the cold. Emily had seen them around before, always in a state of quiet desperation, clothes too thin for the season, eyes too old for their years. She couldn't help but notice the way they looked at the restaurant, their eyes scanning the window as if hoping someone would notice them. She felt a pang of something deep inside her, something she couldn't quite name, a deep, familiar ache. She had once been just like them, alone, vulnerable, lost. Her heart clenched at the thought, and then without thinking, she made her decision. Emily walked toward the door and swung it open. She called out to them softly, trying not to draw too much attention. "Hey, you girls hungry?" she asked, keeping her voice low, as if to protect them from whatever eyes might be watching. The eldest of the three, a girl no older than 16, looked up with a mixture of suspicion and hope. Her eyes were dark and guarded, but there was a flicker of something raw and human that made Emily's chest tighten. "We're fine," she said, her voice rough as if she hadn't spoken in days. "No, you're not," Emily replied gently, her voice softening. "Come inside, I'll get you something warm." The girl hesitated, but the hunger in her eyes was unmistakable. Finally, she nodded, and the three sisters stepped into the warmth of the restaurant. Emily led them to a corner booth, away from the usual customers, and hurried to the kitchen to prepare something simple but filling. As she worked, she glanced back at them. The eldest sister, Lila, had her arms crossed, her gaze wary. The middle one, Mia, was staring at the menu on the wall, her eyes darting nervously. The youngest, Sophie, was the only one who looked like she might crack a smile if given the chance, her eyes wide with wonder, taking in everything around her with innocent fascination. When Emily returned with a bowl of soup and a couple of sandwiches, she placed them gently in front of the girls. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. The silence between them was enough. For a moment, they ate in quiet desperation. Emily sat at the far end of the booth, her eyes flicking over them. She knew the rules: never get too close, never get too attached. Gerald didn't tolerate charity, and there was no room in this world for emotional entanglements. But she couldn't shake the feeling that she had to do something for these girls, something more than just feeding them. "Thank you," Mia finally whispered, breaking the silence. Her voice was soft, almost shy. Emily smiled, but the gesture felt hollow. "You're welcome," she said quietly, then added, "I've been there, you know. I know what it's like to go hungry." The words slipped out before she could stop them, and she immediately regretted it. But Mia, sensing the truth in her words, looked up at Emily with wide, questioning eyes. "What happened?" Mia asked, her curiosity piqued. Emily hesitated, her heart suddenly heavy. Her past wasn't something she talked about, and yet she couldn't help but feel a strange connection to these girls. It was as if their suffering mirrored her own in a way she wasn't ready to confront. Before she could answer, Gerald's voice cut through the moment. "Emily, get back to work," he barked from across the room, his eyes narrowing. She could feel the tension in his voice, the subtle threat of disapproval hanging in the air. Emily nodded quickly, glancing back at the girls. "I'll be right back," she promised, though she wasn't sure she could keep that promise, not with the storm brewing inside her. As she returned to the chaos of the kitchen, her thoughts raced. The girls were hungry, but they were also desperate for something far more elusive. Hope, and maybe, just maybe, she could offer them that. But the question loomed large in her mind. What would it cost her to get involved? What would happen when Gerald found out she was breaking the rules? The tension in the restaurant seemed to grow heavier with each passing minute. Emily could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on her. She couldn't walk away now, not when she had seen the pain in those girls' eyes, not when they needed her, and yet, deep down, she knew that helping them would change everything. But was she ready for that? She had no choice. The pull of empathy was too strong. The night ended, and the girls disappeared into the shadows of Brooklyn once again. But Emily's heart was unsettled. Something had begun between them, something that would change everything. When she walked home that night, the chill of the autumn air seemed to follow her every step. The morning after the girls had left, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something was fundamentally different. She'd gone through the motions of another day at the restaurant, refilling coffee cups, taking orders, dealing with Gerald's unrelenting demands. But her mind kept returning to those three sisters, to the sadness in their eyes, the weight of their silence. She had been just like them, alone, abandoned, forgotten. She walked home that evening, her footsteps slow, as if each one carried the burden of her past. The cold air bit at her skin, but it didn't matter. She was numb to the world outside, trapped in her own head. The streets of Brooklyn felt emptier than usual, the buildings looming like silent sentinels. The city had a way of swallowing people whole, leaving them to fend for themselves. She knew that better than anyone. Emily's apartment was small, barely enough room for a bed and a rickety table in the corner where she could eat her meals alone. She hadn't been able to afford much else, but she was used to it. Her past had taught her to survive with the bare minimum, to make do with what she had. She didn't expect anything more. She didn't believe she deserved anything more. But those girls, they had made her feel something raw, something real. She pulled off her jacket and sat down at the table, staring blankly at the wall. Her mind drifted back to the conversation she'd had with the sisters. Lila, the eldest, had been so guarded, so distrustful. Mia, the middle sister, had been full of questions that no one could answer for her. And then there was Sophie, the youngest, with her wide eyes and gentle innocence. She had reminded Emily of the little girl she once was, before the world had taught her how to build walls. Her fingers traced the edge of the table absent-mindedly as the memories of her own childhood began to resurface. She could still remember the nights when she lay awake in the darkness, the cold seeping through the cracks in the walls of the foster homes where she had bounced around like an unwanted piece of furniture. Her mother had abandoned her when she was just a baby, and her father, well, he was never in the picture. She had learned to fend for herself, to trust no one, and keep her head down. It wasn't until she was placed with the Williams family at the age of 8 that she had tasted a semblance of stability. But that too was fleeting. Mrs. Williams had been kind, but her husband had been cold, distant, and occasionally cruel. Emily had learned quickly not to speak out, not to cause trouble. She had spent most of her teenage years in silence, watching as the world passed her by, always wondering why no one had ever bothered to care for her. She shook her head, trying to push the memories away, but they clung to her like a shadow. She had survived, yes, but at what cost? Her phone buzzed on the table, snapping her out of her thoughts. She glanced at the screen, her heart skipping a beat when she saw a message from the restaurant. "I saw the girls again today. They're hungry. Don't make a habit of this. Gerald." Emily's heart sank. She had known this was coming. Gerald had noticed the girls, and now he was warning her. The tension between them had been building ever since that night. He didn't tolerate charity. He didn't believe in doing anything outside of the rules. But Emily knew she couldn't just walk away. She couldn't turn her back on those girls, not when they needed her the way she had once needed someone. She grabbed her coat and headed back to the restaurant, her thoughts tangled in a mess of guilt and uncertainty. As she walked down the familiar streets, she found herself hoping, despite herself, that the girls would be there. But deep down, she knew it wasn't that simple. When she arrived at the diner, Gerald was already in the back, shouting at one of the kitchen staff. His face was flushed with frustration, his eyes narrowing as he saw Emily enter. "Did you give those girls food again?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. Emily swallowed hard. She had expected this confrontation, but it didn't make it any easier. "Yes," she said quietly, meeting his gaze. "They were hungry." Gerald's expression darkened. "I don't care. You keep this up and you're out of here. You think I'm running a charity? You have to follow the rules, Emily. There's no room for sentimentality." Emily's pulse quickened. She had heard his threats before. She had always been careful not to cross the line, but now, in the face of those girls' hunger, she found herself asking the question that had been eating away at her. Was she willing to lose everything for them? Was she willing to risk it all to give them a chance? Before she could answer, the door to the restaurant swung open and the girls entered, looking as lost as they had the night before. Emily's heart clenched at the sight of them. Lila's eyes flicked nervously around the room, while Mia was scanning the menu, no doubt wondering how long they could make do with whatever scraps they could get. Sophie clung to Lila's side, her small figure barely visible next to her older sister. Emily didn't wait for Gerald's response. She walked straight over to the girls, offering them a warm smile that she knew couldn't hide the worry in her eyes. "Come on," she said gently. "Let me get you something to eat." Lila didn't speak. She just followed Emily to the corner booth, her eyes dark and guarded. Mia, however, looked up at Emily with a mixture of gratitude and curiosity. Sophie smiled softly, her innocence still intact, but the strain in her young face was unmistakable. As Emily sat down to join them, she couldn't help but feel a sense of inevitability. She had made her choice, and there was no going back. The sisters ate in silence, the air heavy with unspoken words. Emily couldn't help but notice how the youngest, Sophie, kept glancing around nervously, as if expecting something bad to happen. She had been through too much for someone so young, and Emily could see the fear in her eyes. "How are you girls doing?" Emily asked softly, her voice gentle. Lila's gaze flicked toward her, but she didn't respond. Instead, it was Mia who answered, her voice quiet but filled with uncertainty. "We're surviving," she said. Her eyes filled with a sorrow far too old for her age. "But it's hard. It's always hard." Emily nodded, her heart aching for them. She understood that. She understood more than anyone. But as she looked at the three girls, she knew one thing for certain. She couldn't turn away. Not now. Not when they needed her the most. The door to the restaurant opened again, and a familiar figure stepped inside. Jonathan Wiles. He looked out of place in the diner. His expensive suit and polished shoes, a stark contrast to the worn-down, ordinary atmosphere of the restaurant. Emily's heart skipped a beat when she saw him, and she froze. He looked right at her, his gaze lingering for a moment before he turned and walked toward the girls. Emily's stomach twisted when she saw Jonathan Wiles enter the restaurant. She recognized him immediately. Who wouldn't? He was a fixture in the media, a wealthy businessman, a millionaire with a name that everyone in New York knew. Tall, with neatly combed dark hair and an expensive suit that didn't belong in a place like this. He wasn't the kind of person who usually wandered into a rundown diner in Brooklyn, and yet here he was, standing just inside the door, looking around as if he had never set foot in a place like this. His eyes met hers for a brief, intense moment, and she felt a strange pull, a feeling she couldn't place. Her heart raced, but she quickly looked away. She couldn't afford to be distracted. Not now, not with everything at stake. He stepped further inside, his gaze sweeping the room, but then his eyes fell on the three sisters, still sitting quietly in their corner booth. Emily watched in stunned silence as Jonathan approached them with the quiet intensity of someone who had just found exactly what he was looking for. Lila, Mia, and Sophie seemed unaware of the sudden shift in the room's energy. Sophie was playing absent-mindedly with a straw, while Lila kept her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her face impassive. Mia was staring down at her soup, lost in thought. Jonathan stopped a few feet away from their booth, hesitating for a moment before speaking. "Lila." His voice was soft, almost unsure, but unmistakable in its familiarity. Lila's head snapped up, her eyes flashing with surprise. She looked at him with a mixture of confusion and suspicion, her protective instincts immediately kicking in. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice sharp, her tone defensive. Jonathan took a step closer, his face filled with emotion. "It's me. It's your father." The words hit like a thunderclap, and the whole restaurant seemed to go silent. Emily felt the blood drain from her face as she stood frozen at the edge of the room. She had known something was off about him, something she couldn't put her finger on, but she never expected this. Lila's reaction was instant and visceral. She shot to her feet, knocking her chair over in the process. "What did you say?" she demanded, her voice trembling with disbelief and rising fury. "You're not our father. He's dead to us. You abandoned us. We don't need you." Jonathan flinched, as if her words were a physical blow, but he didn't retreat. His expression faltered, the weight of years of regret and guilt pressing down on him. "I never wanted to leave you. I made terrible choices, and I've been living with that every day." Sophie, who had been quiet up until now, looked up at him with wide eyes, her confusion turning to something closer to hope. "Papa," she whispered almost to herself, as if testing the word. Lila immediately stepped in front of her, blocking Jonathan's view of the youngest sister. "Don't call him that," she snapped, her voice cold with anger. "You're not our father. You never were." The pain in Jonathan's face was unmistakable. He seemed to shrink under her words, but he pressed on. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, Lila, but I want to make it right. I want to help you girls if you'll let me." Mia, who had been silently absorbing the entire exchange, finally spoke. Her voice was quieter than usual, filled with uncertainty. "You left us. You never came back. How can you just show up now and expect us to forgive you?" Jonathan's eyes flicked to Emily briefly, then back to the girls. "I know. I was wrong. I've spent years trying to fix things in my own way, but I realize now that I was never there when you needed me. I can't change the past. But I want to try to make things right, even if it's a small step." Lila's eyes were blazing, filled with a fury she couldn't quite control. "You think you can just waltz in and make things better? You can't fix what you broke. You don't get to just appear after all these years and pretend like everything is okay. We don't need you." The harshness in her words cut through the room, and Jonathan's face faltered, but he didn't give up. "I'm not asking you to forgive me right away. I'm just asking for a chance to prove that I'm not the man I was before. I can help. I can give you a future, a real one." Emily stood frozen, caught in the crossfire of emotions. The entire scene felt like a terrible storm swirling in front of her. She wanted to say something, to stop the confrontation, but she didn't know how. She wasn't sure what role she had in all of this, if she even had a right to be involved. Her whole life had been about keeping her head down, not getting too involved with anyone. And yet, here she was, standing in front of the sisters who needed her, and a man who claimed to be their father, but had never once shown up when they needed him most. Sophie, her eyes still wide with confusion, looked up at Lila. "But he's our dad, right?" she asked. Her voice a fragile whisper. "He's here." Lila's jaw tightened as she looked down at her younger sister, torn between the need to protect her and the deep, unresolved pain inside her. "He doesn't get to be our dad," Lila said firmly, though the uncertainty in her eyes betrayed her words. "Not after everything he's done." Jonathan lowered his head, as if her words had drained the last bit of hope he had left, but Emily could see the guilt, the regret, still burning in him. He had come here, to this small restaurant, to try and make amends. But was it enough? Could a father's apology truly heal the wounds of abandonment, of years spent without a single word? Before Emily could process her thoughts, Lila turned and stalked out of the booth, grabbing Mia's arm and pulling her along. Sophie hesitated, her eyes darting between her sisters and Jonathan. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but then closed it again, her confusion too much to put into words. Emily followed them, her heart hammering in her chest. She could feel the weight of the moment, the gravity of everything that was unraveling before her. The past was catching up with all of them, and there was no way to stop it. Jonathan stayed where he was, his back slightly hunched, looking as though the very act of being rejected by his own children had drained him of any remaining strength. "Don't go," Emily found herself saying before she could stop herself. Jonathan turned slowly, meeting her gaze. There was something raw in his eyes, something broken. "What do I do, Emily?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "How do I fix this?" She didn't have an answer. She didn't even know what the right thing to do was. But she knew one thing for certain. This was just the beginning, and somehow she was going to have to navigate this storm too. As the sisters disappeared out the door, Emily could feel the tension in the air, like a live wire, ready to snap. The storm had just begun. The next few days felt like a blur, like Emily's life, once predictable, had been turned upside down by the arrival of Jonathan Wiles. The sisters had returned to the restaurant a few times since that first encounter, but their presence was marked by a tension that filled the space between them like smoke. Lila's anger simmered beneath the surface, barely contained. Mia had retreated into herself, her curiosity about her father now tangled with a deep, raw confusion. And Sophie was the hardest to watch. The youngest sister's innocence was still there, but it had begun to crack, exposing the deep pain she carried in her small heart. Emily couldn't stop thinking about them, about the faces they had shown her, faces that mirrored her own past in ways she wasn't ready to face. The weight of their struggles hung over her, pulling her into a world of conflict she wasn't prepared for. And Jonathan, despite his wealth and power, seemed like a man equally lost. His guilt and regret painting him as a figure just as broken as the girl. Her nights were restless, filled with fragments of memories from her own childhood, broken bits of a life she had long buried. Every encounter with the girls pulled her deeper into their world. But every day, the rift between her own past and their present seemed wider, and she wasn't sure she could cross it. It was late one evening when Emily found herself standing in the doorway of the restaurant, watching the sisters as they sat in their usual corner booth. Lila was glancing at the clock on the wall, her arms folded tightly across her chest. Mia was tracing patterns on the table, lost in thought. And Sophie, who had always been the most expressive of the three, sat silently, staring out the window with an air of quiet resignation. Emily took a breath, her heart heavy with the knowledge of how much they were carrying. She could see the weight of their pain, their distrust, even from across the room. She approached them cautiously, her footsteps slow. Lila looked up first, her eyes narrowing as she took in Emily's approach. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice sharp, like a knife cutting through the silence. "I just wanted to see how you were doing," Emily said softly, trying to keep her tone gentle, understanding. She wasn't sure what else to say. She knew Lila would never admit it, but she could sense the cracks forming in the older sister's defenses. "We're fine," Lila replied quickly, but the lie was thin. Emily could see the flicker of something behind Lila's eyes, something softer, something broken, but it was quickly masked by the wall Lila had built up over the years. Mia didn't look up from the table, but her voice, when it came, was laced with a quiet curiosity. "Why are you still helping us?" she asked, her words almost like an accusation. "You barely know us. What's in it for you?" Emily swallowed hard, the question catching her off guard. It was one thing to offer food and shelter, but to offer emotional support, to step into their world like she had, it was another thing entirely. She could see the distrust in Mia's eyes. "I don't know," Emily said honestly, sitting down at the table with them. "I guess I see a lot of myself in you. When I was younger, I didn't have anyone. no one to look out for me. So, I just want to help, that's all. Mia finally looked up, meeting Emily's eyes. You think you can just fix things. You think we can just forget everything. Forget how he left us. Lila flinched at the mention of their father. But it was Sophie who spoke next, her voice small but surprisingly firm. Can't we try? Just try? Sophie's voice cracked, and she looked up at Lila as if searching for permission. Lila's face softened for the briefest of moments, but the hardness quickly returned. We don't have to try, she snapped, though there was a shakiness to her words. We've survived this long without him. We'll survive without him again. Emily's heart broke at the sight of Sophie's sad eyes, at the way she still clung to hope despite everything. The smallest sister, still innocent in so many ways, was the only one still willing to believe in the possibility of a family. I know it's hard, Emily said quietly. I know what it's like to want something you can't have, but sometimes the people who hurt us, whether they know it or not, they don't always stay away forever. Sometimes they come back. Lila stood up abruptly, slamming her hand down on the table. Not him! Not after everything he did, she shouted, her voice cracking under the strain of her emotions. He abandoned us. He left us to rot, and now he thinks he can just waltz back in like it's all fine, like it's all forgiven. The raw anger in Lila's voice was enough to make the entire room fall silent. Emily felt her heart tighten in her chest, unsure of how to respond. This wasn't just about Jonathan's absence. This was about a lifetime of abandonment, of being left behind by people who were supposed to love them. Mia glanced at Lila, her own face torn. She clearly wanted to say something, to argue, but the words wouldn't come. She was caught between her loyalty to Lila and her need to know the truth about her past. Sophie, however, simply stared at Emily, her eyes filled with something more profound than the others, a mix of hope and fear. "Is he really sorry?" Sophie asked, her voice so small that it was almost a whisper. "Is he really going to change?" Emily hesitated. She didn't have the answers. She didn't know if Jonathan could change. She didn't know if he could undo the years of pain he had caused. But what she did know, what she had always known, was that sometimes the first step toward healing was simply the willingness to try. And the second step, the harder one, was forgiveness. "I think he's trying," Emily said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I think he's really trying." Lila shot Emily a look filled with disbelief, but it was Mia who finally spoke, her voice quieter than it had ever been before. "But trying doesn't always fix things, does it?" The question hung in the air, unanswered, and for a moment no one spoke. The weight of everything between them, their past, their pain, their confusion, settled like dust in the air, thick and suffocating. Outside the window, the world continued to move forward, oblivious to the turmoil inside the small diner. But for Emily, the pieces were beginning to fall into place, and she realized in that moment how much she had already become a part of this fractured family. Whether she wanted to or not, she was in this with them, and there was no turning back now. As she looked back at the sisters, at the fractured pieces of their lives, she knew that she had to do something more. She had to help them face the truth of their past, no matter how painful, no matter how impossible it seemed, because sometimes it was the truth, no matter how broken, that could set them free. The days after that conversation felt like a fragile truce had settled over the restaurant. Lila, Mia, and Sophie still came by regularly, but their visits were quieter, more somber. The tension in the air was palpable. Lila's anger still burned hot, but there were moments when it flickered, revealing the cracks in her armor. Sophie, ever hopeful, clung to her innocence, but even she couldn't ignore the storm brewing inside her family. Mia, the most uncertain of the three, spent most of her time watching the world around her, unsure of how to process the emotions that had been unlocked in such a short period of time. Emily did what she could to offer support, but she knew deep down that the girls' journey toward healing wasn't something she could control. She could only guide them, offer a hand when they were ready to take it, and most importantly, show them that they weren't alone. She had never known the comfort of a stable family, but she could create a kind of makeshift family for them, as broken and fragile as it might be. As for Jonathan, he had become a shadow in the background of their lives. He kept showing up at the restaurant, sometimes offering gifts, other times just sitting in the corner, his presence awkward and full of longing. But every time he tried to speak to the girls, they recoiled, keeping him at arm's length. Lila's coldness toward him never wavered. Mia, however, seemed to be inching toward some kind of understanding, though it was clear she was still grappling with the questions she'd buried for so long. And Sophie still looked at him like he was a puzzle she couldn't quite solve. One afternoon, as Emily was finishing up a shift, she saw Jonathan standing near the door of the restaurant looking like he was about to leave. But his eyes met hers, and there was something in his gaze, something desperate, that made her stop in her tracks. "I need to talk to you," Jonathan said, his voice low, as if he didn't want to attract attention. Emily hesitated, glancing toward the corner where the girls were sitting. They hadn't seen him yet, and she wasn't sure she wanted to be in the middle of another confrontation. But Jonathan's expression held a vulnerability she hadn't seen before. It made her heart ache, just a little. "Let's step outside," she said quietly, motioning toward the door. They walked into the cool evening air, the sounds of the bustling city swirling around them. Jonathan stood stiffly, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his suit jacket. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Emily wasn't sure what he wanted from her, but she knew this conversation was inevitable. "I can't fix this," Jonathan said finally, his voice raw. "I can't undo what I did. I can't take back the years I lost with them, and I know they'll never forgive me. Not completely, not like they should." Emily glanced at him, her heart softening despite herself. "I don't think they can forgive you right now," she said carefully. "Not fully, but that doesn't mean it's over. That doesn't mean they'll never find a way back to you." Jonathan's shoulders slumped. "I don't even know where to begin. I've made so many mistakes. I thought money could fix things. I thought I could buy my way back into their lives, but I was wrong. I was a coward." Emily shook her head, her voice gentle but firm. "You can't buy their love, Jonathan. You can't just show up and expect them to forget everything. It's going to take time, trust, and more than anything, you need to show them that you're there, not with gifts or promises, but with your actions." Jonathan nodded, swallowing hard. "I understand that now, but I don't know where to start. I don't know how to show them I'm sorry. How do I even begin?" Emily looked at him, her gaze steady. "Start by being honest. With them, with yourself. Apologize, but don't expect them to forgive you overnight. And then prove to them you're willing to fight for them. Not with money, not with things, but with time, with consistency, with real change." He looked down, clearly grappling with the enormity of what he had to do. "What if they never forgive me? What if I'm too late?" Emily felt a pang of empathy for him. She had seen that same fear in the eyes of so many people in her life. The fear of being too late, the fear of losing everything. "You have to try. That's all you can do." Jonathan's eyes searched hers, a silent understanding passing between them. "Thank you," he said quietly. "I know I don't deserve it, but thank you." As they stood there in the fading light of the evening, Emily could see something shift in Jonathan. It wasn't a dramatic change, but it was real. The burden of guilt he had carried for so long seemed a little lighter, the hope in his eyes a little brighter. The next day, Emily returned to the restaurant with a new sense of determination. She didn't know what the future held for the girls or Jonathan, but she knew one thing for sure. It wasn't going to be easy. Healing never was. The girls were there, sitting at their usual booth. Lila was flipping through a magazine, her brow furrowed in concentration. Mia was looking out the window, her face distant, as if lost in her own thoughts. Sophie was fiddling with her napkin, folding it over and over again, her small hands restless. Emily walked over to them, taking a deep breath. "How are you girls doing today?" Lila looked up, her expression guarded. "We're fine," she said, her voice still sharp, though it lacked the usual venom. Sophie gave her a small, hesitant smile. "Can we have the soup again?" she asked softly, her eyes searching Emily's face as if waiting for her approval. Emily smiled back, her heart aching for the youngest sister's unspoken longing. "Of course, I'll get it right away." As Emily went to the kitchen, she couldn't help but feel a sense of hope stirring in her chest. The storm wasn't over, but maybe, just maybe, they were starting to find their way through it. It wasn't going to be an easy road, but for the first time in a long time, Emily believed they could make it. Later that evening, Jonathan returned to the restaurant. This time, he didn't bring gifts or promises. He simply sat down at a table, keeping his distance, watching the girls from afar. Emily noticed him, but she didn't interfere. She let him make the first move this time. As the night wore on, Lila glanced up and saw him sitting there. There was no anger in her gaze this time, just uncertainty. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, she turned her attention back to her sisters. There was a subtle shift, a quiet acknowledgement that maybe things weren't as broken as they seemed. Maybe there was room for healing after all. Emily stood at the counter, watching the quiet transformation unfold in front of her. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't resolved, but it was a beginning, and in a world where endings were often out of their control, beginnings, however small, were everything. And for the first time in a long time, Emily felt a flicker of something she had almost forgotten: hope.